Thanks for tuning in to Crazy Mango Stories. Give a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell for more betrayal stories. The air between us crackled with tension, but I stayed seated on the couch, as if nothing about this moment surprised me. Marina lingered by the door, expecting my reaction: jealousy, anger, anything. But all I gave her was sarcasm. "So," I said, keeping my voice light, "you're going on a date, huh?" She nodded, crossing her arms, as if bracing herself for the storm she thought she'd just unleashed. Her lips tightened, a clear sign of the discomfort under her cool exterior. "Yes, with Roman, my colleague. I thought I should be honest with you." I chuckled, looking away for a second before meeting her gaze again. "Honest? Well, that's considerate of you." There it was, her frustration, masked by an air of confidence. Marina expected a blow-up, but I wasn't giving her the satisfaction. "Not yet." I leaned back, arms casually spread along the back of the couch. "So, does this mean I can go out and do the same? Maybe, hit up someone from work too?" I've been thinking about expanding my horizons too. My tone stayed casual, a knife wrapped in a velvet glove. Her eyes flickered, caught off guard by my response. This wasn't how she'd pictured this conversation going. "Victor, don't make this a joke." "Who's joking?" I shot back, still smiling but my voice laced with bitterness. "You're setting the rules here, aren't you?" The room filled with the silence of things left unsaid, the real conversation lying just beneath the words. Marina's hand tightened around the doorknob, her face betraying a flicker of confusion. This wasn't the reaction she had prepared for. This wasn't the scene she expected to play out. So in her mind, I was supposed to yell, demand answers, or maybe even beg her to reconsider. But instead, I stayed seated, smiling, throwing sarcasm like it was just another night in our quiet war. "Victor, you're being ridiculous," she muttered, taking a step further into the room, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. "This isn't a game, isn't it?" I said, keeping my voice low but steady, "because it sure feels like one." Her eyes narrowed, the defiant spark growing colder. I watched her, waiting to see how long it would take for her facade to crack. For a moment, she didn't know what to say. She had expected control over this situation, over me. Maybe she thought I'd fall apart, throw accusations, try to hold on to whatever was left of us. But I wasn't playing by her script. "Roman's just a colleague," she began, her voice faltering slightly. "We've gotten close over the last few months, and I—" "Yeah, I got that part," I interrupted, cutting her off with a sharpness that made her flinch. "But you didn't answer my question. The part where I asked if I could start dating too." Her lips parted, but no words came. That silence was enough to confirm what I already knew. She hadn't thought about what my response would be. She had only planned for her own desires, her own actions, and in her mind, I was still just a fixture in the background. "And you really think this is how we move forward?" I continued, my voice dipping into something colder, more dangerous. "They should go out, test the waters with this Roman guy, and I just sit here, or do I get to have some fun too? Just to keep things fair." "Stop it," she snapped, her voice trembling with frustration. "This isn't some tit-for-tat thing, Victor." But I stood up then, the movement sudden and sharp, cutting through the stale tension that had been building between us for weeks, months even. Her eyes followed me, widening as I closed the distance between us. I could see the uncertainty flicker in her gaze, the doubt that had never been there before. For the first time, I wasn't the passive husband, the predictable man she thought she had total control over. "Well, you want to blow up our marriage, Marina?" I said, my voice low but venomous. "Fine. But don't expect me to sit here quietly and watch you walk out on me. You can play whatever games you want with Roman, but don't be surprised when I stop giving a damn." Her breath hitched slightly, and for the first time, I saw a crack in her armor, a glimpse of the fear she was trying so hard to hide. "Victor, this doesn't have to be like this," she whispered, her tone suddenly softer, almost pleading. I shook my head, stepping past her, my voice calm but final. "It already is." Without waiting for her to say another word, I walked past her, grabbing my jacket off the chair and heading for the front door. The game had changed, and this time I wasn't going to play by her rules. The door slammed behind me, the sound echoing through the quiet street as I stepped outside. The cool night air hit my face, sharp and biting, but it wasn't enough to numb the heat boiling under my skin. My thoughts raced, spinning faster than I could make sense of them. I hadn't planned to leave, hadn't even packed a bag or thought about where I'd go. But I couldn't stay in that house, not after what had just gone down. Walking to my car, I fumbled for the keys, my hands trembling with a mix of adrenaline and anger. As soon as I slid into the driver's seat, I slammed the door shut and gripped the steering wheel hard, knuckles whitening under the pressure. My breath came in short, shallow bursts, my chest tight with the weight of everything I hadn't said to Marina, everything I wanted to scream but couldn't. For a moment, I just sat there, staring blankly out at the empty street. To Balmis, my mind replaying the scene in the living room, her standing there so calmly, announcing that she was going on a date with Roman, like it was the most natural thing in the world. And my response sarcastic, biting felt like a hollow victory. Had I really wanted to hurt her, or was I just trying to protect myself from feeling the gut-wrenching betrayal that was eating me alive? I turned the key in the ignition, the engine roaring to life, breaking the silence around me. I had no destination in mind, but I knew I needed to drive, to escape, to get away from the suffocating reality of what had just happened. My hands were steady now, gripping the wheel with purpose as I pulled away from the curb and drove through the quiet suburban streets, the streetlights casting long shadows over the road ahead. As I drove, my mind wandered to Roman. I didn't know him well, but I knew enough. He was younger, single, and by all accounts, charming. The kind of guy who knew exactly how to say the right things to a woman like Marina who thrived on attention, who needed to feel desired. And clearly, he had given her something I hadn't in a long time. My stomach churned at the thought of them together, the image of his hands on her, his lips where mine used to be. It made me sick, but what made it worse was that I hadn't even fought for her. Instead, I had retreated into sarcasm, trying to protect myself from the blow. I turned onto the highway, the familiar hum of the road beneath the tires soothing my nerves slightly. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I needed space. I needed time to think, to process. The truth was, our marriage had been crumbling for a while. Marina's announcement tonight wasn't the start of the end, it was just the final push that sent us over the edge. I'd been avoiding the cracks for too long, pretending we could fix things, but now it was clear. There was no going back. I glanced at my phone, lying face up on the passenger seat, waiting for the inevitable call or text from her. But it didn't come. The silence between us stretched. And for the first time, I wondered if that silence wasn't just the space between two people in a fight, it was the distance between two people who no longer knew how to find their way back to each other. And the worst part was I didn't know if I wanted to. As the highway stretched out before me, a dark ribbon of road leading nowhere in particular, I couldn't stop the memories from creeping in. They came uninvited, sharp and painful, filling the silence inside the car. I hadn't driven far, but I was already 100 miles deep into my own thoughts. I remembered when things between Marina and me weren't like this. There was a time when we couldn't get enough of each other, when every touch was electric, when just sitting next to her filled me with a kind of warmth I hadn't felt in years. Our early days were full of laughter and stolen moments of intimacy, of shared dreams about a future we were certain would always be ours. But then life happened. Jobs got demanding, the bills piled up, and somewhere between the chaos of work, the routines of life, and the slow grind of time, we started losing pieces of ourselves. We stopped trying. I stopped noticing the small things that made her feel loved, and she stopped looking at me like I was the man who could make her world spin. It didn't happen all at once. It never does. It was a slow, quiet erosion, one I had tried to ignore, convincing myself that we were just going through a phase, that every couple hit rough patches. But this, her dating Roman, that wasn't just a rough patch. This was something else, something deeper and more devastating. I pressed harder on the gas, the speedometer climbing as I tried to outrun the thoughts crashing over me. Could I blame her for wanting more? For seeking excitement or validation from someone else when I hadn't been giving it to her for so long? The truth, the ugly, bitter truth, was that I had seen the signs, I just hadn't wanted to admit them. The late nights at work, the way she smiled when her phone buzzed with a message she wouldn't share. Hell, I'd probably known long before tonight that Roman was more than just a colleague. But I had chosen denial because facing the truth was far more terrifying. I reached over to the passenger seat, my fingers brushing against my phone. Still no call. No message. A part of me had expected hope that Marina would reach out, that she would try to fix this. But the screen stayed dark, a silent confirmation that maybe she was already too far gone. Maybe we both were. I pulled off the highway, the car slowing as I turned into the parking lot of a 24-hour diner. The bright neon sign flashed open in sickly green, casting long shadows across the empty lot. I parked, turned off the engine, and sat there for a moment, staring through the windshield as if the answers of this will materialize in front of me. What was I supposed to do now? Go back and fight for her? Try to salvage whatever was left of our marriage? Or walk away, let her have Roman, and just move on? I didn't know. I had never felt this loss before, but what I did know was that I couldn't keep pretending like everything was fine. I couldn't keep hiding behind sarcasm and indifference. I had to make a choice, and no matter what I decided, something would break. Either our marriage would shatter, or the version of myself that had accepted this slow destruction would have to die. I got out of the car and headed into the diner, the doorbell jingling overhead as I stepped inside. The smell of cheap coffee and greasy food hit me familiar and oddly comforting. As I slid into a booth by the window, I realized that for the first time in years, I was completely alone with no idea where to go from here. The diner was almost empty, just a few late-night stragglers hunched over their coffee and plates of cold fries. So I sat in a booth by the window, the neon sign casting an eerie green glow across the table. My fingers drummed absently on the cracked vinyl seat as I stared out into the darkness, my mind running through the same questions over and over. How had we gotten here? And more importantly, what was I supposed to do now? A tired-looking waitress shuffled over, her apron stained and her eyes hollow with exhaustion. She didn't bother with pleasantries, just handed me a menu and waited with her pen poised over her notepad. I barely glanced at the options before ordering a black coffee and a slice of pie, something to keep my hands busy while my mind spiraled. As the waitress disappeared, I found myself reaching for my phone again, almost out of habit. Still no message from Marina. My thumb hovered over her contact name, the urge to call her rising like bile in the back of my throat. But what would I even say? That I wasn't angry, just hurt. That I understood why she felt the need to go to someone else. Or maybe I should call and demand answers, some explanation that might make sense of the wreckage we were now standing in. But I didn't press the button. Instead, I tossed the phone onto the table and ran a hand through my hair, frustration tightening in my chest. She wasn't going to call, and deep down, I knew it. She had made her choice. She had chosen Roman. Or maybe she hadn't chosen anyone yet, but the fact that she was even considering it was enough. The betrayal wasn't in the act itself, it was in the thought. The moment she decided I wasn't enough anymore. The coffee arrived, the mug placed unceremoniously in front of me with a clatter. I stared down at the dark liquid, my reflection staring back at me from the surface, warped and distorted. Who the hell was I now? Just some guy sitting alone in a diner, too proud to admit that his marriage was falling apart, too scared to face the truth of it head on. I took a sip, the bitterness burning my throat, but it was a welcome distraction from the gnawing ache inside me. My mind drifted back to the beginning, to the days when Marina and I were inseparable, when the idea of her with anyone else would have been laughable. We had been so in love, so certain that nothing could tear us apart. But time had chipped away at us little by little until all that was left were the cracks we had both ignored for too long. The waitress brought the pie, sliding it onto the table with the same disinterest as before. I poked at it with my fork, but my appetite was long gone. I wasn't even sure why I had ordered it. Maybe I thought the routine of eating, of doing something normal, would ground me, pull me out of the fog that was clouding my mind. But it didn't work. Nothing could distract me from the reality of the situation I was in. As I sat there, staring blankly at the pie, I realized something that hit me harder than I expected. I wasn't sure if I even wanted to fight for our marriage anymore. The thought crept in quietly at first, then grew louder with each passing second. Did I still love Marina? Or was I just afraid of being alone? Afraid of what life would look like without the familiar routine, without the woman I had spent years building a life with. The questions hung heavy in the air, and for the first time I didn't have an answer. I didn't know if there was anything left to save, or if I even wanted to try. The diner's fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, a constant hum that blended into the quiet stillness of the nearly deserted room. I stared at the pie in front of me, untouched, my fork hanging limply in my hand. The coffee had gone cold, but I hadn't noticed until I took another sip, the bitterness even harsher now. The thought that had crept into my mind in the last hour, did I even want to fight for this marriage anymore, was no longer just a fleeting whisper. It had taken root, growing stronger with every second of silence. The truth was, I had been avoiding this question for a long time. I had convinced myself that things between Marina and me could be fixed, that all we needed was time and a little effort. But sitting here now, in the dead of night, alone in this dingy diner, I felt that certainty slip away, replaced by a gnawing doubt. Maybe we had gone too far, said too many things that couldn't be unsaid, crossed too many lines to ever come back from. Maybe I had let the cracks spread for so long that there was no repairing them. The door jingled as someone else walked in, a trucker by the looks of him, his boots heavy against the tile as he made his way to the counter. I glanced up briefly, then returned to my thoughts. The emptiness I felt wasn't just from Marina's betrayal, it was from realizing that the life we had built together might not be worth salvaging anymore. We had been together for so long, it was hard to tell where I ended and she began. But now, in the stillness of this moment, I was beginning to wonder if maybe that was part of the problem. Somewhere along the way, we had lost ourselves in each other, in the routine of marriage, in the comfort of familiarity. And now, when things had fallen apart, I didn't know who I was without her, or if I even liked who I had become. The waitress passed by again, her eyes scanning the room as if she couldn't wait for her shift to be over. I caught her gaze briefly, and for a moment I saw something in her expression, a kind of quiet resignation, like she had seen 100 men like me come through here, all of us running from something we didn't know how to face. She didn't ask if I needed anything, just moved on, as if she understood that nothing in this diner could fix what was broken. I reached for my phone again, the temptation to check for a message from Marina pulling at me. But there was nothing. No missed calls, no texts. The silence from her end was deafening. I tossed the phone back onto the table, more out of frustration than anything else, and leaned back in the booth, closing my eyes for a moment. In no idea what she was doing right now, if she was with Roman, if they were talking, laughing, maybe even something more. The thought made my chest tighten, but there was something else there too, something unexpected relief. Maybe if she was already moving on, it would make it easier for me to do the same. The idea of letting go felt strange, foreign, but also liberating. If this was the end, then maybe it was a chance for a new beginning for both of us. The more I sat with that thought, the more it settled into place. Maybe Marina had already made her choice, and maybe it was time I made mine. I opened my eyes, staring down at the cold coffee, my reflection fractured and blurry in the dark liquid. For the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to entertain the possibility that this could be it, that I might not want to save us after all. The diner's hum seemed louder as the reality of my thoughts settled in. I tapped the edge of my mug absent-mindedly, staring into the cold, dark coffee. The decision looming over me now wasn't just about Marina, it was about myself, about what came next. Letting go of our marriage wasn't just about walking away from her. It was about walking away from the life we had built. That terrified me, but the weight of staying in something that was already broken felt unbearable. Outside the diner's window, the sky was a deep, inky black, the streetlights casting long, eerie shadows. I could barely make out the occasional car speeding by, its headlights flashing briefly before fading into the distance. It felt like a metaphor for my life, moments of clarity quickly drowned out by the darkness of uncertainty. I leaned back in the booth, rubbing my temples as a dull headache began to pulse behind my eyes. I didn't know what hurt more, the thought of Marina with Roman, or the realization that it didn't hurt as much as it should have. I wasn't numb, not yet, but the sharp sting of betrayal had dulled into something else, something quieter but heavier. And I thought back to our early days together, the way we used to talk for hours about our dreams, our future, how we'd build a life together. We were both so full of hope, so sure that nothing could shake the foundation we were building. But time, as it always does, wore down those ideals. We stopped dreaming together and started just existing, moving through the motions of our relationship without ever really stopping to ask if we were still on the same path. And now here I was alone in this diner, wondering if we had ever been on the same path at all. A buzz from my phone pulled me out of my thoughts. I glanced at the screen, half expecting it to be Marina, but it wasn't. It was a message from my brother, a random joke he'd sent, completely unaware of the mess I was in. I stared at the message for a moment before turning the phone face down again. I couldn't deal with anyone right now, not even family. I wasn't ready to talk about what was happening because I wasn't even sure I understood it myself. The waitress passed by again, her expression unreadable as she refilled my coffee without a word. I thanked her quietly, even though I didn't plan on drinking it. My mind was elsewhere, spinning in circles around the same thoughts. What do I do now? Do I confront Marina, demand answers? Do I wait for her to come to me? Or do I do the unthinkable, walk away and never look back? The thought of leaving felt heavy, like a door closing behind me that I'd never be able to reopen. But there was also a strange sense of freedom in it. If I walked away now, I wouldn't have to deal with the fallout, the pain of trying to fix something that had already broken beyond repair. I wouldn't have to see her with Roman, wouldn't have to wonder if I could ever trust her again. I glanced around the empty diner, the silence wrapping around me like a blanket. For the first time, I considered the possibility that maybe walking away was the only real option left. Maybe staying would mean clinging to a version of myself I didn't want to be anymore, a man who kept holding on, even when everything was telling him to let go. The thought lingered as I sat there, the cold coffee in front of me untouched, the darkness outside pressing in. Maybe the hardest part wasn't letting go of Marina, it was letting go of the man I had been in our marriage. The decision had been forming in the back of my mind, slow and deliberate, like the tide pulling away from the shore. Sitting in the diner, the weight of it all finally hit me. Maybe it was time to let go. It wasn't the dramatic, heart-wrenching moment I had always imagined, no tears, no grand epiphany. Just a quiet, sobering realization that our story, the life Marina and I had built together, had come to its inevitable end. I stared out the window into the night, my reflection faint in the glass, barely recognizable. I didn't see the man I used to be, the one who fought for every piece of his marriage, who believed in forever. No, The man sitting here was someone different, tired, worn out by the years of trying to keep something alive that had been slowly dying for a long time. The door jingled again, and I glanced up as another lone customer walked in, taking a seat at the counter. Life went on, even when you were in the middle of your own personal collapse. The world didn't stop for Hardash. It didn't pause to let you catch your breath. And as I sat there, surrounded by the mundane hum of the diner, I realized that I wasn't angry anymore, not at Marina, not at myself. The anger had burned itself out, leaving only the dull ache of acceptance. I took a slow breath, my fingers tapping lightly against the table. Leaving her didn't feel like the end of the world anymore. It felt like the beginning of something else. What that something was, I didn't know yet, but for the first time in months, maybe years, I felt a sliver of hope. Not hope for us because whatever we had was broken beyond repair, but hope for me, for whatever came next. Ian, I picked up my phone one last time, but I didn't open her messages. I wasn't waiting for an apology or an explanation anymore. I wasn't going to sit in that space of uncertainty, hoping she'd tell me what I wanted to hear. It didn't matter. The truth was simple, she had made her choice. And now it was time for me to make mine. I tossed some bills on the table, more than enough to cover the coffee and pie, and stood up, sliding my jacket on as I made my way toward the door. The cold air hit me as I stepped outside, but this time it felt different, bracing, but not unwelcome. I walked to the car, taking my time, my steps steady. There was no rush now. As I got in and started the engine, the road stretched out ahead of me, long and empty, leading somewhere unknown. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel lost. I didn't feel weighed down by the uncertainty of it all. I knew I wouldn't go back to that house tonight. Maybe not ever. Marina had made her bed, literally and figuratively, and now she could lie in it, with or without Roman. And I wasn't going to wait around to find out. I glanced at the rearview mirror, watching the diner fade into the distance behind me, a tiny speck of light swallowed by the night. My fingers tightened on the wheel, and I pressed down on the gas, the engine roaring to life as I sped down the highway. There was no clear destination in mind, no grand plan for what came next. But for the first time, that didn't scare me. For the first time, the thought of the unknown felt like freedom. And as the miles passed, I let go of the life I had been clinging to for so long. So I let go of Marina, of the broken promises, of the anger. I let it all fade into the rear view, where it belonged. And I drove forward, into whatever came next.